The air inside the Easton City Grand Conservatory was heavy with the soothing scent of blooming orchids and damp earth. For Sarah Jenkins, a 34-year-old woman in a faded, oversized beige cardigan and sensible walking shoes, this humid sanctuary was a weekly ritual. She stood near the terraced indoor waterfall, a lukewarm herbal tea in one hand, adjusting her tortoise-shell glasses as she read a small brass plaque about tropical ferns. To the dozens of families and tourists milling about the complex, Sarah was just another face in the crowd, a quiet, unremarkable woman enjoying a peaceful Saturday afternoon. There was absolutely nothing in her gentle, soft-spoken demeanor to suggest that just 3 years ago she was known under the call sign Valkyrie across a half-dozen forward operating bases. Nothing to indicate she was a retired Special Operations Surgical Team, SOST, trauma surgeon, a legendary Tier 1 military combat medic who had spent a decade performing miraculous field surgeries in the backs of violently pitching helicopters under heavy enemy fire. She had traded the deafening roar of rotors, the smell of cordite, and the weight of body armor for the quiet hum of climate-controlled greenhouses, desperately seeking a life of profound, boring normalcy. Today, the conservatory was particularly crowded. A local elementary school was hosting a weekend scavenger hunt. Just 10 yards away from Sarah, a young boy, perhaps 9 years old, wearing a bright yellow dinosaur backpack, was leaning over the brass railing of the upper walkway, excitedly pointing at the koi pond below. His mother, laughing, was stepping backward, trying to wrangle him into posing for a photograph. It was a picture of perfect, fragile civilian peace. Then the sanctuary shattered. It started with a sound that Sarah recognized instantly, a sound that bypassed her conscious mind and directly spiked her dormant adrenaline. The deep, resonant groan of failing structural metal under immense tension. High above, near the apex of the massive glass dome, a primary steel support bracket gave way. It snapped with a deafening noise like a cannon shot, echoing sharply off the curved glass walls. Before anyone could even look up to locate the source, a massive section of the ceiling collapsed. A heavy, rusted steel frame, dragging 3 huge panes of thick architectural glass with it, plummeted 50 feet directly toward the crowded walkway. The impact sounded like a localized explosion. The ground shook violently, throwing several tourists off their feet. A storm of dust, mist from the waterfall, and heavy, jagged debris erupted over the koi pond area. For one agonizing, suspended second, there was absolute, terrifying silence in the pavilion. Then the screaming began. Total panic consumed the conservatory. Bystanders shoved past each other in a frantic, terrifying stampede toward the exit doors. Parents blindly grabbed children, knocking over botanical displays in their desperate bid to escape what many believed was an earthquake or an attack. The peaceful sanctuary instantly transformed into a zone of absolute, uncontrollable chaos. Sarah did not run. While the crowd fled in blind terror, Sarah stood perfectly still. The civilian persona, the quiet cardigan-wearing woman looking for peace, vanished in a fraction of a second. Her posture snapped straight, her breathing slowed to a rhythmic, tactical pace, and her eyes scanned the disaster zone with the cold, hyper-focused calculation of an elite operator suddenly dropped into a hot zone. Through the settling dust, her eyes locked onto the point of impact. She saw the mother on her knees, shrieking hysterically, desperately trying to lift a heavy section of the twisted metal frame. Trapped beneath it was the boy with the yellow backpack. Sarah dropped her tea. The ceramic cup shattered against the pavement, entirely unnoticed. She moved swiftly against the tide of fleeing people, dodging panicking adults with fluid, practiced movements. As she closed the distance, her mind automatically began running a rapid tactical triage. The boy was pinned, but the beam wasn't crushing his chest. However, a large, jagged piece of structural glass had deeply lacerated his upper thigh. Even from 10 feet away, Sarah saw it. A dark, rhythmic pulsing was spreading rapidly across the boy's torn jeans, soaking the white gravel beneath him in a terrifyingly fast, expanding dark pool. an arterial bleed, a femoral strike. Worse, the boy was gasping violently, his chest rising unevenly, his lips already taking on a terrifying shade of blue. The blunt force of the falling beam had done massive, critical internal damage. A security guard in the distance was yelling frantically onto a shoulder radio, screaming for paramedics. But Sarah knew the brutal, unforgiving math of trauma. In a panicked, gridlocked city on a Saturday afternoon, an ambulance was at least 10 minutes away. The boy had less than 90 seconds before his heart pumped the last of his life out onto the gravel. There was no time to wait for official help. There was no time to hide who she really was anymore. The quiet life was over. Sarah reached back, feeling the reassuring, hidden bulk of the tactical blowout kit tucked into the waistband of her jeans, and sprinted straight into the nightmare. Sarah closed the 10-yard gap in seconds, moving with a fluid, predatory grace that entirely belied her quiet civilian exterior. Around her, the botanical garden was a blur of frantic motion, echoing with the shrieks of terrified tourists and the crunch of heavy boots on shattered architectural glass. But inside Sarah's mind, the world had gone entirely silent. The fatal funnel of combat had engaged. There was only the objective, the dying child on the gravel. She dropped to her knees beside the boy, the sharp edges of broken safety glass tearing through her sensible slacks. She didn't feel it. Her eyes swept over the 9-year-old, her brain automatically processing his catastrophic trauma through the rigid, deeply ingrained framework of the military's March protocol. Massive hemorrhage, airway, respiration, circulation, head. The mother was kneeling beside the boy's head, sobbing hysterically, her hands fluttering uselessly over her son's face. "Leo! Leo, baby, please! Somebody help my baby!" she screamed, looking wildly at the circle of paralyzed bystanders who had stopped to gawk but were too terrified to intervene. "Ma'am, move back," Sarah said. Her voice was no longer the soft, timid murmur she used when ordering herbal tea. It was a sharp, commanding bark, carrying the undeniable weight of absolute authority. The mother, shocked by the sudden, intense tone, instinctively recoiled just enough for Sarah to get to work. Sarah's hands moved with blinding speed. First, the massive hemorrhage. The heavy steel bracket that had pinned the boy's lower leg had also driven a massive, jagged wedge of tempered glass deep into his upper thigh. The dark red blood wasn't just pooling, it was actively spurting in time with his racing, fading heartbeat. A classic, catastrophic femoral arterial bleed. Every pulse drained another crucial ounce of his life force into the white decorative gravel. 60 seconds, Sarah's mind calculated coldly. He has 60 seconds before hemorrhagic shock becomes irreversible. She pressed her bare hands directly into the wound, ignoring the warm, slick feeling of blood soaking her cardigan sleeves. She didn't feel it. Her eyes swept over the 9-year-old, her brain automatically processing his catastrophic trauma through the rigid, deeply ingrained framework of the military's March protocol. With her hands locked on the bleed, Sarah analyzed his upper body. Her eyes tracked the terrifyingly shallow, asymmetrical rise of his chest. His right side wasn't moving at all. The heavy falling beam must have struck his ribcage before sliding down to pin his leg. His lips were a deeply bruised, cyanotic blue, and the veins in his small neck were bulging unnaturally against his pale skin. A tension pneumothorax. The blunt force trauma had punctured his lung, causing air to leak into the pleural space with every desperate gasp. The trapped air was building immense pressure inside his chest cavity, crushing his remaining healthy lung and slowly choking off his heart's ability to pump. 2 minutes, her internal clock amended. If he doesn't bleed out in 1 minute, his heart stops from the pressure in 2. Over the din of the panicked crowd, Sarah heard the faint, static-laced voice of the security guard's radio a few yards away. "Dispatch, we have a mass casualty incident. Need EMS immediately. Over." "Copy. Units are en route. Heavy traffic on the interstate. ETA is 12 minutes. Do the best you can." 12 minutes. In extreme trauma medicine, 12 minutes was an eternity. It was a death sentence. To the official paramedics fighting traffic across the city, little Leo was already a lost cause.
He was just a body waiting to be tagged. Sarah looked down on the pale, fading face. She had spent 3 years trying to bury the ghosts of her past, trying to forget the faces of the soldiers she couldn't save in the dusty, blood-soaked sands of foreign combat zones. She had sworn off the adrenaline and the crushing responsibility of holding another human's life in her hands. She just wanted to be normal. But she was Valkyrie, and Valkyrie didn't let people die on her watch. "Not today," Sarah whispered, her jaw setting into a hard, unforgiving line. She deliberately let go of the civilian life she had built. The quiet, unremarkable woman evaporated, replaced entirely by the elite SOST trauma surgeon. She shifted her weight, maintaining critical pressure on the child's severed artery with her knee, and reached under her oversized cardigan. Her fingers closed around the familiar, rigid nylon of the tactical blowout kit she had worn concealed every day since her discharge, a secret anchor to a life she thought she had left behind. With a sharp tug, she ripped the kit free.
The sharp, ripping sound of Velcro cutting through the ambient panic was the official end of Sarah's civilian life. She deployed the compact nylon pouch onto the white gravel, revealing a meticulously organized arsenal of combat trauma supplies. She didn't look up as she issued her first command, her voice projecting with the authoritative boom of a drill sergeant. "You, in the blue jacket." A burly man standing paralyzed 2 feet away flinched. "Get on your knees right now. You work for me," Sarah roared, locking eyes with him. "Do it." He dropped to the gravel instantly, his shock overridden by her absolute command. Sarah turned to the hysterical mother. "Ma'am, look at me." The mother kept screaming. Sarah grabbed her shoulders, giving her a sharp shake. "Look at me. I am a trauma surgeon. I am saving your son, but I need you to hold his hands and look at his face. Do not look at his leg. Do it now." Given a mission, the mother's hysteria funneled into desperate focus. She scrambled to Leo's head, clutching his small hands. "Guard," Sarah barked at the stunned security officer. "Clear a 10-foot perimeter. Nobody steps inside this circle. If they try, put them on the ground." "Yes, ma'am." The guard drew his baton, frantically pushing the gawking bystanders back to create a secure pocket in the chaos. The zone was secure. Now the medicine. Sarah pulled a combat application tourniquet, a cat, from her kit. Her muscle memory was flawless, forged in the pitch-black cabins of medevac choppers. She slid the loop up Leo's ruined leg, positioning it high and tight against his groin, well above the catastrophic wound. "Blue Jacket, hold his hips down. This is going to be brutal," she warned. She pulled the routing band violently tight and began twisting the rigid windlass rod. 1 twist. 2. The boy's back arched in unconscious agony, a weak, gurgling moan escaping his lips, but Sarah didn't hesitate. She gave it a 3rd, brutal twist, crushing the tissue against the femur until the massive arterial spurting finally ceased. She locked the rod into the plastic C-clip. "Time applied, 14:10, she muttered, pulling a black marker from her kit and slashing the numbers across the boy's forehead so the paramedics wouldn't miss it during handover. "Is he okay?" Blue Jacket stammered, staring at the blood-soaked stones. "We just bought him a minute," Sarah replied coldly. "The TQ stopped the gusher, but the cavity is weeping. I have to pack it." She ripped open a packet of hemostatic gauze, fabric impregnated with a rapid blood-clotting agent. "Blue Jacket, pull the edges of that laceration apart." The man gagged at the sight of the deep tissue. I can't." "You will do it, or this boy dies." Sarah's voice was a physical strike. Trembling, he obeyed. Sarah plunged her fingers directly into the torn muscle, feeding the clotting gauze deep into the cavity, forcefully packing it against the severed vessel by pure touch. "Hold this," she ordered, guiding his large hands over the packed wound. "Put your body weight on it and do not let up." Massive hemorrhage controlled. She shifted instantly to the airway and respiration of her march protocol. She leaned over Leo's face. His lips were taking on a grayish, ashen pallor. His chest was locked in a terrifying, asymmetrical spasm. His right side was completely rigid, ballooning outward, while his left side fought desperately to pull in a single breath. Sarah ran her bloody fingers quickly across his throat. Her stomach dropped. His trachea was visibly deviating to the left. His windpipe was literally being pushed sideways inside his neck. The tension pneumothorax was critical. Trapped air from his punctured lung was actively crushing his heart. He wasn't just suffocating, his cardiovascular system was entering obstructive shock.
If she didn't vent that trapped air in 30 seconds, his heart would stop forever. Sarah reached into her blowout kit and withdrew a rigid plastic tube. She cracked it open, revealing a terrifyingly long 14-gauge ARS decompression needle. The sheer size of the heavy steel spike caused the surrounding crowd to gasp in unified horror. She had to punch this 3-inch needle blindly into the chest of a child, right through the intercostal space with zero anesthesia. And if she miscalculated her landmark by even a fraction of an inch, she would pierce his failing heart herself. She placed 2 fingers on his collarbone, feeling for the second intercostal space, and raised the heavy needle.
The entire conservatory held its collective breath. The mother squeezed her eyes shut, unable to watch as the quiet woman in the oversized cardigan transformed into an instrument of surgical violence. Sarah found her landmark, the mid-clavicular line, right above the superior border of the 3rd rib. She had to stay high to avoid severing the delicate neurovascular bundle tucked safely beneath the bone. She didn't hesitate. With a sharp, practiced, and unforgiving downward thrust, she drove the heavy 3-inch steel needle directly through the boy's chest wall. The mother shrieked in horror. Blue Jacket gagged, squeezing his eyes tight but blindly keeping his heavy, crushing weight on the packed femoral wound exactly as ordered. Sarah felt the distinct tactile pop as the thick needle punctured the parietal pleura. Instantly, a sharp, incredibly loud hiss erupted from the plastic hub of the catheter, sounding exactly like a slashed tire rapidly deflating. The trapped, pressurized air that had been ruthlessly crushing the boy's heart was venting straight into the humid atmosphere of the botanical garden. "Got it," Sarah muttered, her voice dropping an octave into pure, icy focus. She smoothly withdrew the inner steel trocar, leaving the flexible plastic catheter safely embedded in its chest cavity to keep the vent open. Almost immediately, the terrifying rigidity in Leo's right side collapsed. His chest wall fell naturally, and his trachea visibly shifted back toward the center of his throat. The extreme, fatal pressure was gone. But the victory lasted only a fraction of a second. Leo's small body suddenly seized in a violent, rigid arch, and then he went terrifyingly, utterly limp. The agonizing, gasping breaths stopped completely. The faint, bruised blue of his lips rapidly drained into an ashen, translucent gray. Sarah slammed 2 blood-slicked fingers against the boy's carotid artery. Nothing. The massive blood loss combined with the prolonged lack of oxygen had pushed his fragile system over the edge. His heart, finally freed from the crushing pressure of the collapsed lung, simply didn't have enough fluid volume left to keep beating. "He's gone! Oh my God, he's gone!" the mother wailed, collapsing onto the gravel, her hands flying to her face in ultimate despair. "You killed him!" "Shut up and hold his hand," Sarah roared, a terrifying primal bark that silenced the mother instantly. "He is not dead until I say he is dead." Inside, Valkyrie's mind was running at light speed. Hypovolemic shock transitioning to arrest. No time to drill an IO line. I need to force oxygen into his blood and manually stimulate the central nervous system. She abandoned the chest and moved straight to his head. She reached into her kit, ripping open a foil packet containing a nasopharyngeal airway, a flexible trumpet-shaped rubber tube. She coated it rapidly in a packet of sterile surgical lube. Tilting the head, opening the airway, she announced to nobody but herself, locking the boy's jaw open and driving the NPA smoothly down his right nostril to keep his tongue from collapsing against the back of his throat. She pulled a collapsible pocket resuscitation mask from the bottom of her pouch, snapping the plastic dome open and sealing it aggressively over his nose and mouth. She blew 2 sharp, controlled breaths into the one-way valve. She watched his healthy left lung rise and fall. Good compliance. The airway was perfectly open. She tossed the mask aside and balled her right hand into a tight, hard fist. She pressed her knuckles directly into the center of Leo's sternum and began grinding them down with agonizing, brutal force. A sternal rub. The ultimate raw pain stimulus designed to shock a fading central nervous system back online. "Come back, kid," she growled, her teeth gritted as she dug her knuckles into the bone. "Don't you dare quit on me. Come back right now." She ground her knuckles harder, ignoring the mother's renewed, horrified weeping. 10 seconds passed. 15. The white gravel was a disaster zone, and the quiet woman in the cardigan was fighting a hand-to-hand war with the Reaper himself. 20 seconds. Suddenly, beneath her knuckles, the boy's chest hitched.
It was a wet, ragged, agonizing gasp, but it was independent. Leo's eyelids fluttered, rolling back to reveal the whites of his eyes. Sarah's fingers snapped back to his carotid. A pulse. It was faint, terrifyingly thready, and racing at a panicked, erratic speed, but it was there. The pump had restarted. "I have a pulse. Spontaneous respirations," she breathed out, the first hint of humanity returning to her rigid posture. "He's fighting." Just as she said it, the heavy, muffled wail of multiple approaching sirens finally pierced the thick glass walls of the conservatory. Official help had finally arrived, and they were about to walk into a masterpiece of battlefield trauma surgery.
The heavy, double-glass doors of the Grand Conservatory burst open with a violent crash. 2 city paramedics, laden with heavy jump bags, cardiac monitors, and a collapsed backboard, shoved their way desperately through the bottlenecked crowd of fleeing tourists. "Move! EMS! Make a hole! Step aside!" Lead paramedic Dave Miller, a hardened 15-year veteran of the city's busiest firehouse, expected total chaos. He expected hysterical bystanders, screaming relatives, and a dying victim surrounded by helpless panic. He did not expect the chillingly controlled, tactical perimeter waiting for him past the security guards. The white, decorative gravel surrounding the koi pond was stained a stark, horrifying crimson. In the absolute center of the carnage knelt a woman in a blood-soaked beige cardigan and sensible walking shoes, her hands working over a small, pale boy. Beside her, a terrified civilian in a blue jacket was pinning the boy's leg to the earth, his large hands buried beneath layers of blood-soaked gauze. "Hey, step away from the patient," Miller bellowed, dropping his heavy trauma bag and rushing forward, his partner right on his heels. "Ma'am, get your hands off him, you're gonna—" Miller stopped dead in his tracks, the breath hitched in his throat. He saw the rigid, high-and-tight combat tourniquet biting deep into the boy's upper thigh. He saw the black marker time slash across the child's pale forehead. He saw the blue hub of a 14-gauge ARS catheter protruding flawlessly from the boy's chest. He saw the green rim of a nasopharyngeal airway perfectly seated in the right nostril. This wasn't panicked civilian first aid. This was aggressive, elite-level combat life support. Sarah didn't even look up at the paramedics. Her eyes remained violently locked onto the boy's chest rise. "Paramedics, listen to me," she barked, her voice cutting through the ambient wail of the sirens like a surgical blade. She didn't wait for Miller to acknowledge her. The military handover rolled off her tongue with the rapid-fire mechanical precision of a seasoned combat medic coordinating a hot extraction under fire. Mechanism of injury: catastrophic crush and blunt force trauma from falling architectural steel and glass. Time of injury was roughly 7 minutes ago, Sarah rattled off, her tone entirely stripped of emotion. Miller and his partner froze, their mouths slightly parted. The quiet woman in the ruined slacks sounded exactly like a chief trauma surgeon briefing an emergency room bay. "Injuries found," she continued seamlessly, never breaking her intense rhythm. "Massive arterial hemorrhage to the right femoral artery, complex laceration. Tension pneumothorax on the right side. Secondary head trauma unconfirmed but probable. Symptoms: patient entered profound hypovolemic shock progressing to respiratory and cardiac arrest roughly 3 minutes ago. No palpable radial pulse, weak and thready carotid at 140. Pupils are sluggish but reactive." She finally snapped her head up and locked eyes with Miller. Her eyes were hard, cold, and heavy as the steel beam that had fallen from the ceiling. "Treatment given," she commanded, the absolute authority of Valkyrie radiating from her small frame. "Right femoral hemorrhage controlled with a high and tight cat tourniquet at 14:10 hours. Wound cavity packed with hemostatic combat gauze and manual pressure maintained. Needle thoracostomy performed with a 14-gauge at the second intercostal mid-clavicular line to vent the pneumo. Airway secured with a 28 French NPA. Spontaneous respirations restarted via sternal rub." She paused, taking a single, sharp breath. "He is critical, he is dry, and he needs a massive transfusion protocol and an immediate surgical suite. Do you copy?"
Miller blinked, completely stunned. In 15 years on the rig, he had never received a missed report this flawless, not even from other seasoned first responders. The interventions were perfect, the timing was miraculous. This unassuming woman had literally dragged this child back from the absolute brink of death using nothing but her bare hands and a pocket-sized nylon kit. I copy, Miller stammered, his rigorous professional training finally overriding his sheer disbelief. He snapped his head toward his partner. Get the board. Get the high-flow oxygen on him. We need to load and go, right now. The paramedics descended on the boy, moving with the frantic, highly coordinated energy of men who knew they had just been handed a miracle, but still had to fight a war to keep it. "Ma'am," Miller said, reaching for the boy's packed leg wound to take over manual pressure from the trembling civilian in the blue jacket. "I've got the bleed. We've got him. Let go." Sarah held her position for one agonizing second longer, her eyes tracking Miller's hands to verify his grip was secure. Then, slowly, the invisible armor dissolved. The terrifying, godlike authority bled out of her posture. She released her hold on the child. She pushed herself backwards, sliding on the slick, bloody gravel to completely surrender the space to the medical team. She was suddenly just Sarah again, a 34-year-old woman sitting on her knees, her hands trembling violently as the massive adrenaline dump began to crash. She watched them strap the boy to the bright yellow backboard. He was still pale, still critical, but his chest was rising and falling. He was alive. But as the police officers finally breached the perimeter to secure the chaotic scene, Sarah realized she had left her tactical gear scattered in plain sight.
The heavy gurney wheels clattered loudly over the shattered architectural glass. Miller and his partner moved with frantic, practiced precision, securing little Leo's strapped body for the transport. The boy's chest was rising, weakly but rising. The ARS needle jutted safely from his ribs, the tension relieved, and his airway remained perfectly clear. The mother, still trembling uncontrollably, chased the stretcher toward the exit. Right before she reached the double doors, she stopped. She turned back to look at the blood-stained woman kneeling on the white gravel. She didn't have the words. There were no words big enough for pulling her child back from the abyss. She just pressed her shaking hands to her mouth, tears streaming down her face, and mouthed a desperate, silent, "Thank you." Sarah offered a single exhausted nod. Then the paramedics were gone, swallowed by the wailing ambulance outside. The immediate crisis was over, but the Grand Conservatory was a disaster zone. Dozens of police officers in heavy tactical vests were surging into the pavilion, securing the structural collapse and cordoning off the blood-soaked koi pond. Sarah sat back on her heels. The icy, godlike focus of Valkyrie was rapidly evaporating, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. Her beige cardigan was ruined, her hands slick with drawing blood. With trembling fingers, she reached out and began gathering the discarded wrappers of her blowout kit, the empty hemostatic gauze foil, the plastic sheath of the chest dart. Heavy black boots crunched on the gravel beside her. "Ma'am, I need you to stay exactly where you are," a gruff, commanding voice ordered. "We need a full statement. EMS said you're the one who kept that kid breathing." Sarah looked up. Standing over her was a veteran police sergeant. His uniform was immaculate, his silver hair cropped close to his scalp in a military high and tight. His heavy brass nameplate read, "Harris." "I just did what I had to do, officer," Sarah said, her voice instantly returning to the soft, quiet, timid murmur she used to order herbal tea. She zipped her nylon trauma pouch shut, desperately trying to conceal the specialized gear. But Sergeant Harris didn't pull out a notepad. His eyes were locked onto the small, blood-spattered nylon pouch in her hands. He looked at the discarded military-issue combat tourniquet wrapper. He looked at the perfect, rigid, tactical perimeter she had ordered the security guards to hold. Then his eyes moved to her face, studying the hollow, thousand-yard stare that only came from carrying the weight of the fallen. He knelt down, his knee crunching into the glass. He didn't speak as a cop talking to a civilian. He spoke as a soldier. "That was a textbook needle decompression, ma'am," Harris said quietly, his voice dropping so the other officers couldn't hear.
and a perfect high and tight TQ placement under catastrophic stress. Dave Miller is the best medic in this city, and he just told my lieutenant over the radio that whoever was working on that boy was a goddamn ghost. Sarah froze, her fingers tightening protectively around her kit. I have medical training. I just helped. Harris reached out gently and tapped the edge of her nylon pouch. Tucked inside the inner flap, barely visible, was a faded olive-drab Velcro patch. It bore a blood type and a faded tactical call sign, Valkyrie. Harris's eyes softened with profound, unspoken understanding. He had seen that look before. He knew the heavy, suffocating cost of trying to blend back into a normal world after living in the fire. My son was in the Korengal Valley, Harris said softly, his voice thick with sudden emotion. He took shrapnel to the neck in 14. A Soest bird flew through a blind mortar barrage to pull him out. A flight surgeon packed his carotid in the pitch black and kept him alive just long enough to see his daughter born. Sarah looked into the old man's eyes, seeing the raw, unvarnished gratitude of a father who understood exactly what it took to do what she had just done. "You don't need to give a statement, Doc," Harris whispered, slowly standing back up. He turned his broad shoulders, deliberately blocking the view of the other approaching officers, creating a physical shield between her and the flashing police lights. "The area is secure. You are free to go." Sarah slowly stood. Her legs ached, and her hands were still shaking, but the crushing weight on her chest felt just a little bit lighter. She gave the sergeant a slow, deliberate nod, a silent salute between two people who knew the true cost of service. "Welcome home, Valkyrie," Maris murmured. Sarah didn't look back. She tucked her blood-stained trauma kit into the waistband of her ruined slacks, pulled her oversized cardigan tight around her shoulders, and quietly slipped past the police tape. Within seconds, she blended perfectly into the frantic crowd of shaken onlookers, fading back into the shadows. She was just an ordinary, quiet woman, walking away into the afternoon sun.